2 years ago, I gave up the power of being a CEO to be part of a self-managed team. And it all started with a book called Reinventing Organizations by Frederic Laloux. Now, I read a lot of books, but this book was so powerful, it almost made me shake. It inspired me that there's a new way of working without hierarchy, without command and control, and that the leading organizations of the future will have 3 things in common: bringing your whole self to work, a focus on purpose, and self-management. And I wanted to
view where it's really a lot about information and knowledge. There, suddenly, the shifting such that, people aren't just cogs. We have to manage, people's thinking, and we have to get most out of people. So, suddenly we have to look at all these soft aspects, right? And this, we only look at the hard aspects, right? You only look at the machine, right? And so, you have then these incredibly powerful culture-driven organizations that have been written a lot about, right? Organizations that really say, for us, it's all about culture. There's a famous sentence, right, that says that, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? It's Peter Drucker who said that. And the idea is, if we have a powerful culture, if people just love coming to work, if the people are just happy, if people are passionate, then, everything else will be all right. We'll have a great strategy. But the other one is not true. If we have a great strategy but people are not passionate, then not much will happen. Right? And so the breakthroughs have all to do with the soft side of things. So these organizations are very, very committed to their culture and to their values. And the values, in these organizations, people aren't cynical about the values because they really, really mean something. They're fanatical about empowerment, the idea that you should push things, decisions to the lowest kind of level. And then a whole discussion about we should step away from purely the shareholder model and we should go to this kind of stakeholder model where we put suppliers and customers and employees all on the same level. Right? And this is a revolution that is still ongoing, and there's lots of research that seem to indicate that, again, these organizations pretty much dramatically outperform the orange organizations. Everybody here needs to work in harmony. Everybody here should feel welcome, should feel that they have their place. It's a very, very strong metaphor that these leaders use. Right, so we've had organizations as wolf packs, organizations as armies, organizations as machines, organizations as families. And then the question is, what's next, right? And so over the last 3 years, I've been spending a lot of time identifying and studying in great depth a number of organizations, 20, 30 organizations, and 12 in particular depth, that are pretty large organizations. They all have several hundred, most of them several thousands people, that already operate on something that is just totally new. And as I told you, what struck me is the degree to which, even though they don't know each other, they operate in very similar ways. So I really believe that we're hitting onto that new level. And these are the names of these organizations. And I show them because I believe that probably you won't have heard
organize yourself without a manager. Now, Daniel Pink says that the secret to high performance and satisfaction at work is meeting our deeply human need to control our own lives. And that means having control over task and time, where you work, when you work, and how you work. And none of this.
So these organizations manage to operate at very large scales. Some have thousands, tens of thousands of employees, entirely without the pyramid, entirely without anyone being the boss of anyone else. And I know that sounds extraordinary. It sounds like a recipe for chaos. Right? How could you ever run a large organization without hierarchy? I mean, that just doesn't make any sense. By the way, I wasn't expecting this when I started the research. Right? My idea was, I think we've all grown up with this idea that, maybe we can have a group of 4 or 5 people working without a boss. Okay, that's okay, 4 or 5 people. But as soon as you're more than that, come on, right? You need a structure, you need a boss. Right? And what I found out is that the truth is, yes, you need structure, but no, you don't need a boss. This is really a place where we need to upgrade our thinking, right? Basically the story of going from 1 brain to 3 brains. Let me suggest a different way to think about hierarchy in organizations, which I think is more truthful. And it's the following. It's that hierarchy kind of works okay in environments with low complexity. Then hierarchy is doing okay. So if complexity is low, you can have a pyramid. But as soon as you have high complexity, hierarchy is simply out of its depth. Because you see, hierarchy always stacks up in a pyramid and pushes all of that complexity up to the top. And there's only so much complexity that the few people at the top can handle, can work with, right? And actually, if you look at all truly complex systems that exist in the world today, they all operate with mechanisms more powerful than hierarchy. Okay. Let me give you an example. The global economy, right? Billions of consumers, millions of companies, trillions of decisions made every day, and there's no one in command, right? You don't have a boss of the global economy, right? The only 2 countries that still try to run an economy with a pyramid are North Korea and Cuba, right? And I think it's quite funny that we think this idea is ludicrous for an economy. I mean, who would run their economy like North Korea and Cuba? But we insist that that's the way we should run things inside organizations, right? So here you have hugely complex system. You have lots of structure. You have lots of coordinating mechanisms, but you don't have a boss. Or take a forest. A forest is an incredibly complex ecosystem. It looks kind of simple. We see these big trees, but there's really everything from massive trees to, billions of, microorganisms. And all of that works in some sort of magic. If the winter comes in early, all of that system will adapt at the same time and change information. There isn't, one massive tree that is the CEO that says to everyone else, "Hey, you freeze, don't do anything." Me and my buddy trees from the executive committee, we'll come up with a plan. And when we're ready, we tell you what to do. No doubt that as the world is becoming more and more complex, we will naturally have to shift the way we run organizations to principles that underlie all of these complex systems. Right? And I sense that this illusion we have about organizations today is that the world is becoming so complex, and somehow our pyramids cannot cope. And what they've had to do is that they had to reinvent pretty much everything. If you don't have a pyramid, you have to put something else besides. You can't just say, "Hey, we'll just get rid of hierarchy," then you have chaos. So you have to replace one consistent set of practices with another one. And so they've had to reinvent pretty much everything. The organizational structures, but how do you run projects? How does information flow? If there's no boss, who decides on who makes how much money? How do you deal with conflicts? How do you decide, who can spend and invest how much money? Right? All of these things they had to invent. And again, what's fascinating is that many organizations that didn't know of each other invented pretty much identical processes and systems.
Approach to home care that's different in 2 ways: how people are supported and how the team works together. The well-being in well-being teams stands for both people supported and for team members. You cannot do one without the other. There are 8 ways that self-managing well-being teams are structured and supported. The first is the handbook and person-centred team plan. These are the 2 important documents that describe the way that the team works. Team members have a copy of the Wellbeing Workers Handbook, and each team co-creates their own person-centred team plan. Together, they form the basis of the induction. For each new team member, this is a completely different way of working, and the handbook is a way to explain what this means, so people can keep coming back to it until it becomes second nature. Whilst the handbook is standard, every person-centred team plan is different, as it's created by the team as their personal way of working together, and it starts through the induction. For example, a team plan will include 1-page profiles for each team member, people's individual purpose and the co-created team purpose, individual and team values and strengths, team agreements, how we're going to work together, how we're going to give each other feedback, how we stay in touch as well. The person-centred team plan is kept updated and live in 2 ways, through the development sessions in team meetings and through the person-centred team review every 6 months. The second way is roles. As the team manages itself, there are specific roles that managers would have done that the team does themselves. Some of these are shared roles and others are taken by different individuals. The role that's shared in a wellbeing team is the role of the link wellbeing worker for each individual who's supported. The other roles are for meeting facilitator and development, community navigator, scheduler, that's doing the rotas, and assistive technology. The decision about who does which role is made during induction based on strengths and interests. People take roles for about 6 to 12 months, and the person who's taken the role then becomes the coach for the next person who takes the role on. The third way is coaches, and there are 2 kinds of coaches in wellbeing teams. There are short-term coaches for the specific roles and an overall team coach. For each of the roles we mentioned, there's a coach who has expertise in that area. For example, the community navigator role is coached by the community circle connector. This coach's role is to support the new team member for 2 to 3 months until they're competent and confident in that role. The overall team coach is the registered manager who supports the team through induction and ensures that each person is competent in their role as a link wellbeing worker and passes the care certificate. Then her role is to be available to support the team to problem solve. Team coaches are not decision makers, but they can facilitate problem solving and offer advice if asked, but the decision always stays with the team. The fourth way is buddies. Unlike the short-term role of coaches, each team member has a buddy within the team, another team member. The purpose of having a buddy is to both support and challenge each other and to provide feedback. People choose their own buddies and together they work out how to stay connected and how often. The fifth way is various ways to stay connected. For example, the team uses the top-rated app Slack to stay in touch. Each team has its own channel for team communication, and there are also channels for people who fulfill the same roles across different teams. For example, there's a channel called Community, where the community circle connectors and the community navigators across a range of teams connect to share tips or ask questions. The sixth way is through team meetings, and the team meeting process combines positive and productive meetings and elements of the holacracy tactical meetings. So this includes a review of actions and metrics to look at team performance, updates on any changes for each person supported by the relevant link wellbeing worker, and then the 2 main areas of the team meeting are raising and addressing tensions, problems or issues, and a development session. The development sessions are to continue to develop as individuals, to deepen the team's understanding of each other, and keep developing and improving how we work together. At the end of each session, the team meeting facilitator will check whether the team has learnt or changed anything that means that the person-centred team plan needs to be updated. The 7th way is through scenarios. Each fortnight,
there's an hour's session via video conferencing to look at scenarios. Scenarios are real situations that have happened, and the team reviews the situation and what they could learn from this. This could be how to improve an outcome, or other ways to solve a problem, or practicing moving from outcomes using the support sequence. Team members present their situation, and the coach works with the group to facilitate, support, and challenge. This is how the team keeps developing its practice, using real-world situations so they can practice thinking creatively and solving problems in new ways, as well as getting feedback. And finally, the 8th way is through the person-centred team review. Every 6 months, the team coach facilitates a person-centred team review. This means looking at what's working and not working from different team members' perspectives, in relation to living the team's purpose, the team's agreements, roles, and processes. This leads to the team agreeing their own outcomes and actions for the next 6 months and updating the team plan to reflect this. The design of the structure and support for wellbeing teams is inspired by Buurtzorg and draws heavily on our existing work on person-centred teams, Daniel Pink's work on motivation, and Keegan and Leahy's deliberately developmental organisations. These 8 ways are how we put the well-being for staff in well-being teams.
What happens when people aren't doing the work that they should do? So the second feature of a self-managing team is how you hold each other to account. So please imagine for a minute that you work, that every week after work, you go out for a drink with your colleagues and everybody buys around. And somebody new joins your team and comes out with you, and they don't buy around. And the next week you go out for a drink again, and the person doesn't buy around again. Or in your shared house, there's somebody who never does the washing up, always leaves their cups in the sink. How do you feel? Annoyed? Irritated? Cross? And what would you do? When I ask people this, most people give me a version of moan about them behind their back. Some people's versions of moan about them behind their back include expletives, because it's hard to have some difficult conversations. It's hard to hold people to account. Or to use Brené Brown's words, we choose comfort over courage. Now, in a self-managing team, we've got different ways to try and address that. And the first is about having team agreements, because you can't hold somebody to account unless you know what you're committing to together, what you can expect from each other. So in Becky's team, there are clear agreements about how they're going to work together that are explicit, recorded, shared, and reviewed. But how do we support Becky to have difficult conversations? Well, these people help. So what helps Becky is both people and processes. So in this photo, you can see Michelle, the team coach, and Jodie, Becky's buddy. And everyone in the team has a buddy, and the role of the buddy is both support and challenge. So if Becky went up to Jodie and was moaning about somebody not doing the washing up, Becky would say to her, how do you want to address this? Do you want to go and have the conversation directly with the person, or are you going to raise it at the team meeting? Because in self-managed teams, meetings are different. There's an expectation that you raise and address tensions so that things are dealt with really early. Or if Michelle, the team coach, had seen lots of washing up and sensed some tensions around that, she'd hold a mirror up to the team and say, are you seeing this? What do you want to do about it? Or the third reason, or the third way this could happen, is through a person-centred team review. So this is a regular review where the team comes together to look at what's working and not working, about how we're living our purpose, living our values, and keeping our agreements.
And traditionally, we think that there's only 2 ways to make decisions, right? Either hierarchical decision-making or consensus. So top-down decision-making, we might not like what the boss decides. The boss might make a stupid decision. It might trigger all sorts of politics to try to influence that person. But at least someone makes a decision and, we can move forward. Consensus sounds great in principle. But the problem with consensus, as, if you've tried it, is it's often very long and exhausting, and you don't get to a decision. And in the end, everybody is just frustrated, and somebody says, like, can someone please make a decision, whatever it is, I don't care, but like at least we make a decision. And in many organizations, by the way, we're a bit in between, right? We're theoretically in the hierarchical decision making, but we somehow want people to feel included, so we do a bit of both. And running large organizations without hierarchy is only possible because these organizations have invented a third way to make decisions. One of these organizations, AES, 40,000 people, called it the advice process, and I think it's a good word for it. The advice process is somehow transcends these two, somehow the best of both worlds. So the way advice process works in principle is that any person in the organization can make any decision, including spending company money, under two conditions. They must have sought advice from people who have expertise, and they must seek advice from people who will have to live with the decision, who will be impacted by the decision. Okay? So if I'm a machine operator, and this happens a lot in these organizations, I can decide to buy a new machine that costs 300,000 euros or $1 million. And what I need to do before I make that decision is I need to talk, maybe someone from finance who can tell me about, financial calculations. I might need to talk to an engineer that has an idea of the whole flow of things, and I have to talk to my colleagues who will have to operate the machine with me. Right? But I don't need to seek any approval. And I don't need to integrate what people say into watered-down consensus. So if you've thought my advice, at the end you can say to me, hey, Frederick, I've really listened to what you said, but for these and these reasons, I've decided to still do something different. Right? And the reason this works so well is two things. One, it's a process of collective intelligence. People have to collect the intelligence of people with expertise and people that will live with the decision and really think about it before they make a decision. But it stays an individual decision. So if I feel strongly about something, I can just make it happen. No one can stop me. I seek advice, I think about it, I make a decision. So you have organizations where everyone is empowered to do whatever they feel is necessary. So imagine just the kind of energy that liberates. And it works remarkably well because at all times we are on different sides of the equation. So sometimes you come and seek advice from me, and I really hope that you will take my advice into account. So when you come to ask me for advice, I really think about it hard before I discard it. Right? And people know that one of the few ways to get kicked out of these organizations, is if you don't respect the advice process, is if you just, randomly go and make decisions, because then, you're putting in peril the whole system. Right? And we can talk later about how do you actually kick out people from organizations when there is no boss, right? That's a whole different question. Operating large organizations entirely without hierarchy. And the second one is one I've called wholeness. Now this one is a bit more subtle, but just as powerful. See, in most organizations, there is an expectation that we show up in a specific way, that we show up as in a professional self. Most organizations push us somehow to wear a mask, professional mask of what is acceptable in organizations. And maybe some of you will say, hey, no, that's not true. I'm exactly the same. I'm at work that I am at home. And that might be the case, but for most people, that's not the case. And in some cases, I think we delude ourselves. We are so used to wearing that mask that we're somehow even forgot that we're wearing it. Right? And here's a way to illustrate that. let's take a simple dichotomy, right? We all have our ego, and we all have, sort of deeper part, deeper convictions, longings. And the strange thing is that very quickly in most organizations, we learn that showing up with the ego, showing up in meetings, fighting to look good and, fighting for our careers and stuff, that's pretty acceptable. But showing up with, deeper questions, our deeper hopes, our deeper longings, very quickly becomes very risky. Right? You can take an example in any kind of industry. Let's take an example in, let's say, the advertising industry. Right? Imagine a colleague calling in all the other colleagues and saying, hey, I want to have a really important discussion with you guys. I sometimes wonder what we're busy with. I mean, we're creating all these needs with people for products that they actually don't really need, that get produced in China, pollute the world, get shipped over, used once, thrown away, trash the planet, and all of those people who can't afford them become unhappy. What are we really dealing with? The person who would call in that meeting probably won't make a very long career, right? Right? Or take doctor in hospital who would call in a meeting and saying, hey, we've reduced, healthcare. We've turned this hospital into these kind of factories, and we've forgotten about really what it truly means to care, which is the relationship with the client, the patient, all of the emotional and the spiritual component of healing, right? Probably, wouldn't get a very good reception. And so, we learned that, let's not talk too much about that, and let's just, fight for our careers, and we, start playing these ego games. Another dichotomy is, we all men or women have a masculine side and have a feminine side, right? And in most organizations, we quickly learn that the masculine is appreciated, right? Whether we're man or woman, showing resolve and determination and, being very clear on what we want to achieve and, looking forward and not backwards, and all of that is very much, appreciated. And the more feminine part that we all have, which is the more nurturing, the more caring, the more questioning, the more vulnerable side, we quickly learn that is a part that, doesn't really help us forward. Right? And so we all tend to show up much more masculine and much more determined than we really are, never showing doubts, never showing vulnerabilities, right? And another way to look at things is, we all have a rational side, but we all also have an emotional, an intuitive, a spiritual side. And again, the rational side is very valued in organizations. But the intuitive, if we can't really prove it with numbers, and certainly emotional, no emotions in organizations, and the spiritual, no, come on, no, that shouldn't be part of organizations, right? And so we end up, showing this very narrow, ego, masculine, rational side of us. When that is the case, we also only show up with basically 1/16 of our energy, of our passion, of our creativity. And so they have put in place very deliberate, very conscious practices to open up that window and to really invite us to show up in the full glory of our humanity, of who we are. And when that happens, things are just extraordinary. People in these organizations just, brim with energy because they can be, fully who they are. And again, there's a great number of things that they have reinvented. And the third breakthrough is one we could call evolutionary purpose. All organizations say that they have a purpose, but ultimately, when it comes down to it, in the end, often, making money is the thing that we prioritize over purpose, right? And in many organizations, people are a bit cynical about their mission statement. Now, when you talk about purpose, the purpose of Buurtzorg is to help people live, rich, meaningful, autonomous lives, right? And you could say that the way they operate, this whole thing is really their competitive advantage, right? That's what made them go from 0 to 80% market share. In any traditional organizations, they wouldn't speak much about that. That would be their big secret, right? They would, lock their competitive advantage, in a vault like Coca-Cola does with its secret formula, right? But purpose is still pretty easy to, I think, to understand. But it gets a bit more, more wild than that. You see, in most traditional organizations, we have this paradigm that the role of leaders is to, determine a vision, a strategy, and then some, execution, some implementation plans to get there, right? That's the role of leadership, right? And, makes perfect sense, right? How could it be in any other way? When I started this research, that just totally made sense to me. But the leaders of these organizations say, no, losing some of you, right? So the role of leadership is to say, where does this organization naturally want to go? And let's just align with that, because if the organization wants to go there, if I try to go here, we'll just exhaust ourselves fighting what we're naturally called to do. And that reflects itself again in a whole host of practices that these organizations do differently. Going from strategy to change management and planning and budgets and setting targets, all of that again is quite different. None of these 12 organizations that I researched in depth has a strategy. And all of them are really outrageously successful organizations, and they don't have a strategy, which sounds crazy. They have a very clear sense, a very clear intent, like Buurtzorg. We want to help people live a more rich, meaningful, autonomous life. But they don't have a strategy. Right? Most of these organizations don't have budgets, by the way. Right? Don't have targets. Salespeople without targets sounds crazy, but because they say anything that we put in the ground is a distraction from reality. Right? When we do that, when we try to predict the future, what happens is that we then stop actually listening to reality. We so much want reality to stick to the plan that we've laid out, right? That we stop listening to reality. So we should do the opposite. We should have a very clear intent of where we go, but then we should constantly listen and constantly adjust. All corners, and like in an ecosystem, some of these innovations are powerful and they spread quickly through the whole ecosystem. And other innovations, no, they don't work and they fall off again. But it isn't, central steering that will decide, hey, this will work. You actually let reality decide what works and doesn't work, rather than trying to impose it.